Okay, let's unpack this. Lecanemab, this new drug for early-stage Alzheimer's, it just got the green light from the European Medicines Agency.
That's right, April 15th, 2025. Pretty big news.
Huge news. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, the whole journey to get here. It shows up some really stark differences in how these kinds of drugs are looked at around the world.
Yeah.
So what's going on? Why the different approaches? And, what does it actually mean for you trying to follow these medical breakthroughs?
Well, what's fascinating is we're drawing this directly from the ADPD 2025 forum in Vienna. We heard straight from the people involved.
Right, the sources.
Exactly. Regulators from the EMA, Japan's MHLW, clinicians, with boots on the ground experience in the US and Israel, researchers from Sweden, the UK.
A real mix.
A real mix. And they were really digging into these different regulatory philosophies, the priorities for approval, using lecanemab as the main example. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack all that, understand the why behind it, and hopefully give you a clearer picture of this whole global drug approval scene, especially for something as huge as Alzheimer's.
Cutting through the jargon.
Trying to cut through the complexities, and just get to the crucial stuff.
Right. So lecanemab, it's already approved in quite a few places, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. US, Japan, China, South Korea, Hong Kong, UK, Israel, some Middle Eastern countries, too.
And now the EMA's joined that list.
Yeah.
But back when this forum happened, the EU decision was still up in the air.
Correct.
Still pending.
And it's interesting, Canada wasn't even looking at it then, apparently. And Australia, their regulators, which, just to be clear, are different from the European Medicines Agency.
Right, pick your body.
Their approval is kind of waiting on the EU decision. So, this patchwork of approvals really screams different approaches.
Absolutely. And if we connect that to the EU approval process itself, it's really important to get that it's not just one decision maker.
The EMA, specifically its committee, the CHMP, they give a scientific opinion, but that's not the final word.
Right.
That opinion then goes up to the European Commission. And that involves reps from all 27 member states. They're the ones who actually grant the marketing authorization.
Oh, okay. So consensus needed.
Yeah.
Or a majority.
Yeah, consensus or a majority. And that's a massive difference compared to, say, a single body like the FDA in the US.
Totally different model.
Completely.
Yeah.
This multi-layered EU system, it just naturally explains why their timeline might be different, why they might land differently on safety, efficacy, whether a drug fits their populations.
That makes sense. More cooks in the kitchen, potentially?
You could say that, yeah. It leads to a more collective, maybe more cautious decision sometimes.
Okay. Now, Japan, they also approved amyloid beta therapy, but we heard they're rolling it out under, quote, very strict regulations. What's the story there?
Yeah, Japan's experience is really interesting. They've treated, about 8,000 patients so far? And the early data suggests a lower rate of ARIA, the amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, the brain swelling or microbleeds.
The main safety concern, right?
Exactly. They're seeing about 7 to 8%, which is roughly half what the clinical trials showed.
Huh, interesting.
And infusion reactions are lower, too, around 10% versus higher in the trials. So on the surface, it looks safer in their real-world use than maybe expected.
Why is that, do they think?
Well, this cautious approach, these strict guidelines, it likely reflects maybe a cultural focus on minimizing risk, gathering lots of real-world data before going wide.
Kind of a measure twice, cut once approach?
Sort of, yeah. A contrast to maybe a move fast and break things approach elsewhere. They've put really firm guidelines on how to use the drug, balancing costs, safety, potential benefit. It's a fascinating real-world example of a different risk-benefit calculation.
So available, but very controlled use. Now let's jump to the UK and Israel. Both approve these anti-amyloid antibodies, but there's a snag, isn't there?
Yeah, and this brings up that crucial next step. Access after approval.
Right.
In the UK, the drug regulator said yes, but NICE, the body that decides what the National Health Service pays for, they said no to reimbursement.
Too expensive.
Cost-effectiveness concerns, basically. So it highlights that approval doesn't automatically mean patients get the drug.
And Israel.
Israel was early, even with aducanumab. But similar problem. Reimbursement is mostly private insurance, so estimates are over half the people who might benefit can't access it.
So same outcome, different reason.
Yeah.
Approved, but not accessible for many.
Exactly. Bridging that gap between regulatory approval and actual patient access is a huge challenge.
It really seems like a theme here. Getting the okay is one thing, getting it into people's hands is another. Now, we also heard from a U.S. clinician. Their take was a bit different, suggesting maybe the risks are being, I don't know, overblown.
Yeah, that clinical perspective is vital. The argument goes something like this. For someone with mild cognitive impairment or very early Alzheimer's with amyloid confirmed, the disease is going to progress severely over years. So from that angle, the potential side effects of the drug, why real, might seem, well, less daunting compared to the certainty of decline.
The known risk of the disease versus the potential risk of the treatment.
Precisely. And the U.S. experience plus this early Japanese data, it suggests if you pick patients carefully look out for vascular issues, for example, the risks can be managed.
So frustration from that side about the slower pace elsewhere.
Definitely. You heard frustration, particularly with the European process. It's that classic tension, the perceived urgency to treat versus a more measured, perhaps cautious evaluation.
And that European caution, did it partly stem from questions about who was on the initial EMA review committee for lecanemab?
Right.
Was there a feeling they didn't have enough hands-on trial experience?
That point was raised, yeah. But what's important is seeing how these bodies adapt.
Okay.
The EMA acknowledged it. They brought in external experts, clinicians who had actually given the drug in trials to share that real-world perspective.
So they adjusted, learned.
It shows a process, right? Incorporating feedback.
Yeah.
And it also highlights something crucial. Risk tolerance isn't uniform. It's deeply personal. It's got to be part of that doctor-patient conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. Risk tolerance is so individual. Now, Alzheimer's, it's not monolithic, is it?
Yeah.
Early onset, late onset, maybe gender differences, the APOE4 gene. How do regulators deal with all that variation?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle. They absolutely look at subgroup analyses. Does it work better in this group? Is it riskier for that group?
But it's not just slicing and dicing the data afterwards, right?
No. There are strict rules. Study has to be positive overall first.
Mm-hmm.
The subgroups need to be defined before the study starts, ideally.
Pre-specified.
Exactly. And there needs to be a solid biological reason why you'd expect that group to respond differently. The goal is always to find who gets the most benefit with acceptable risk.
And we saw that with lecanemab's final EMA approval.
We did. They specifically excluded patients with 2 copies of the ApoE4 gene.
Try them specifically.
Well, ApoE4 is linked to more inflammation, maybe more vascular fragility in the brain. So the thinking is people with 2 copies might be at higher risk for ARIA, so they were excluded.
Okay.
And also, patients on anticoagulants were excluded because of a higher risk of brain bleeds.
Yeah, tailoring the approval based on these specific risks. Makes sense. Now let's pivot to donanemab. FDA said yes, EMA said no. That feels like a major divergence.
It definitely raised eyebrows. It's a significant split.
What was the EMA's reasoning, publicly at least?
The main reason stated publicly, and the full assessment comes later, after the commission decides, was basically that the safety concerns outweighed the benefits they saw.
Even though the FDA saw it differently.
Right. And it's important to remember these agencies, FDA, EMA, Japan, Canada, they talk. They share data under confidentiality agreements.
Okay, so they see the same evidence.
Largely, yes. But they operate under different legal frameworks, different regulatory mandates, so they can interpret the same data and arrive at different conclusions.
Which is what happened here, seemingly.
It seems so. The UT researcher expressing surprise really underlines how puzzling it can be when the science seems aligned, but the decisions diverge repeatedly. Maybe the U.S. prioritizes speed, accepting a bit more initial risk for an unmet need.
While the EU, with its multi-state system.
Exactly. Emphasizes maybe more collective caution, waiting for more long-term data, which can mean delays, but potentially a more robust population view.
It really shows there isn't just one right way to regulate. Okay, looking forward. What about treating people before symptoms even show up? Preclinical Alzheimer's. What's the regulatory thinking there?
Oh, that's a really complex frontier. It pushes hard on how we even define disease.
How so?
Well, the big challenge is, when does someone transition from being a healthy person with a biomarker, like amyloid, to being a patient, just based on a scan or a blood test?
Tricky. Are there trials looking at this?
Yes, absolutely. Trials like AHEAD, Trailblazer 3, Trailrunner 3 are ongoing. But regulators are generally cautious about using just, say, amyloid removal as proof the drug works.
I need more.
They want to see a clinical benefit eventually. or at least stabilization of other biomarkers more closely linked to actual brain damage, like tau or neurofilament light.
And the risk calculation must be different for someone with no symptoms.
Totally different. Risk tolerance is likely much lower. Proving benefit will probably need very long trials with really careful clinical follow-up.
Long-term data needed again.
Yeah, and Japan's approach of mandating long post-marketing studies could be really valuable here. Ultimately, tackling preclinical AD needs new frameworks for diagnosis, combining clinical insight and biology, developed with experts.
So it's not just about the biology, it's linking it clearly to preventing or delaying actual symptoms. Now, we mentioned the European Commission earlier. How does their finals, say, add a different flavor compared to the FDA?
Right, so the EMA Scientific Committee, CHMP, gives the recommendation, but the European Commission grants the actual license to sell the drug.
Okay.
And the key difference is the Commission, representing the member states, can consider non-scientific factors in their decision.
Like what? Politics, economics.
Potentially, yes. It introduces a political dimension that just isn't part of the FDA's process, which is focused primarily on the science of safety and efficacy.
So it's not purely a scientific call in the end in the EU. That adds another layer I hadn't quite grasped.
It does. It adds complexity.
That's really interesting. We also heard Australia's regulators suggested limiting lecanemab to people without the APOE4 gene. Did the EMA think along similar lines?
Oh, absolutely. That kind of discussion is standard. Regulators like the EMA routinely talk with the drug companies about potential restrictions.
To find the right patient group.
Exactly. To see if the drug works best or is safest in certain subgroups, like based on genetics. The final EMA decision to limit lecanemab to people with 0 or 1 copy of ApoE4 came out of those kinds of discussions. It's all about pinpointing who benefits most while managing risk.
Okay. Now, inevitably, questions come up. Has the EMA, with its caution, maybe underestimated how serious Alzheimer's is? Or maybe are they acting in the interests of payers, trying to keep costs down?
That's a criticism you hear sometimes, but it's important to be clear. Payers are explicitly not part of the EMA's decision-making.
Okay, that's definite.
Absolutely. The EMA's foundation is scientific expertise. They have this huge network of scientists, clinicians supporting the committee members, many of whom, like the panelists we heard from, have clinical backgrounds themselves.
They know the disease.
They know the disease. They stress their decisions are based purely on rigorous science, talking constantly with patient groups, staying current with the field. The idea they're downplaying the disease or secretly working for payers. It really misrepresents their role and the expert evaluation process.
That's a really important clarification, sticking with the science. Biomarkers are moving so fast, especially blood tests. How are they changing things?
They hold huge promise, especially blood tests, for making diagnosis easier, less invasive, more accessible.
Right.
This two-cut point method for things like phospho-217 is interesting. It helps define positive and negative for amyloid risk more clearly, but it also acknowledges this gray zone.
What happens in the gray zone?
Well, the recommendation, certainly in places like Sweden, is caution. Often means follow-up tests, CSF, or an amyloid PET scan to confirm.
So not replacing the other tests entirely yet.
Not yet, and crucially, biomarkers always need context. You have to rule out other causes for cognitive problems. While some U.S. centers might use blood tests more readily if other options are scarce, there's still a global discussion, like in Japan, about exactly how and when to best fit them into the diagnostic sequence.
Okay, so a powerful tool, but still needs careful integration. What about following healthy people from trials long term? Could that teach us about prevention?
It's an appealing idea, understanding prevention that way, but running trials in truly healthy people without knowing their biomarker status is tough. You'd need incredibly long studies to see anything meaningful.
Years and years.
Decades, maybe. But trials in preclinical AD people with no symptoms but known amyloid buildup, those are happening now. Like the AHEAD study.
Because you have a targeted population.
Exactly. You know they're at risk, and you can follow them for a defined, albeit still long period. Improving how we collect real-world data consistently could also help, maybe through shared platforms. But yeah, even for early symptomatic AD, 18 months for a trial is pretty short for such a long, varied disease.
Good point. Okay, quick question. Is there a big difference in how fast early onset versus late onset Alzheimer's progresses?
Generally speaking, not dramatically. From when symptoms start to, well, the end,
Hmm.
It averages around 10 years for both. Maybe
Yeah.
the rare, purely genetic autosomal dominant form is a bit quicker.
Right.
But clinically, you do see older folks with amyloid who progress very slowly. In those cases, looking at tau as well, maybe CSF tau can really help clarify the picture and decide about treatments like lecanemab, perhaps used with extra caution.
Right. Adding more biomarker info helps.
Yeah.
And what about using things like, say, brain shrinkage hippocampal volume as a direct measure for drug approval, a surrogate endpoint?
That's a very high bar for any biomarker to be used as a surrogate endpoint, meaning it stands in for clinical benefit for approval. You need rock-solid proof of a direct link between changes in that biomarker and something clinically meaningful for the patient. Often you need separate studies just to validate the biomarker itself. You can't easily use the same trial data for both drug effect and biomarker validation.
Okay, sounds tough to prove definitively. So looking ahead, now that we actually have some approved disease-modifying therapies, does that make it easier for the next wave, maybe better drugs?
There's definitely hope for that. Having these first approvals sets a precedent. It shows regulators are willing to approve drugs targeting the underlying biology.
Opens the door a bit.
Kind of signals that innovation is welcome. It could streamline things for future therapies, maybe ones that cross the blood-brain barrier better, or are given subcutaneously instead of infusion. Regulators often frame themselves as partners in innovation.
Not just gatekeepers.
Right. And nobody expects a single magic bullet cure anytime soon. It's about incremental gains, maybe targeting different disease pathways. Plus, everyone's learning how to design these trials better based on past experiences.
That's encouraging. One last thing, biomarker diversity. We touched on APOA4. Are there other differences across ethnic groups we need to consider?
That's an important area. Early signs suggest blood biomarkers seem to work similarly well in large Asian populations compared to Caucasians.
Okay.
But there's less data and more research needed, particularly for African and African American populations, especially around how tau responds when amyloid is targeted. It's definitely an area needing more focus to ensure equity.
Absolutely crucial. Okay, so let's try and bring it all together. The bottom line seems to be that the global regulatory world for Alzheimer's drugs is, well, messy. It's complex. Different places focus on different things: risk tolerance, cost, access, what evidence they need.
Yeah, it's definitely varied. You've got the multi-layered EU process, Japan's super cautious rollout, the US may be moving faster, others with unique funding or access hurdles.
And the science is just racing ahead, isn't it? Especially with biomarkers and understanding the disease even before symptoms. That's going to keep shaking things up for regulators.
Absolutely. It's a constantly evolving landscape.
So what, for you listening, is that understanding these differences helps you read the headlines about new drug approvals with maybe a more critical eye.
Exactly. To see, it's not always straightforward. Science and regulation are partners, but they sometimes take different paths, different timelines to get treatments to people. Lecanemab's story and the debates around others really just highlights how dynamic this whole field is.
Right. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. As our tools get sharper for diagnosing Alzheimer's way earlier, maybe even before symptoms really hit, how will regulators worldwide adapt? How do you balance that urge for early access against the need for really solid proof of safety and benefit in people who still feel healthy? What role will patient voice and these evolving biomarkers play in those huge decisions down the road? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.